everyone, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rachel Stoll. I want to welcome you to our webinar on multilateralism and armed drones, escaping the gridlock. We'll get started in just a few minutes as we wait for our participants to join. So please bear with us, and we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar on multilateralism and armed drones, escaping the gridlock. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm Vice President of the Stimson Center, and I really want to thank you all for joining us today for a discussion on the role that multilateral fora can play in developing international standards for the transfer and use of armed drones around the world. I'm really pleased to co-host this event with PAX, and I'm looking forward to the informative conversation with our expert panelists and all of you joining in from all over the world. We do want this to be an interactive event, so you will see that you have a Q&A option in the bottom of your screen, and I encourage you throughout the conversation to pose your questions, and I will get to them in our discussion period. PAX and Stimson have a long partnership working together to develop international standards on armed drones. And we normally hold a side event on this topic during the United Nations First Committee, but I'm extremely grateful that we're able to hold this event virtually this year so we can not only expand our audience, but really discuss these current efforts to develop international drone standards and the efforts to minimize the risks associated with the transfer and use of lethal drones in a time which I think is quite relevant. So certainly the transfer and use of armed drones have been points of discussion within and outside the United Nations for several years as states examine the legal and regulatory mechanisms that guide such activities, and key stakeholders work together to minimize the risks associated with such use. And as I said, these discussions really reflect critical and timely issues as lethal drone technology continues to proliferate around the world, and as we see the ramifications of these drone exports and use in places like Libya and Somalia, Yemen, and more recently, Nagorno-Karabakh. Two central concerns often guide our interest in developing international drone standards. First is the lack of clarity surrounding states' legal and regulatory frameworks that justify drone use. And second is the related secrecy surrounding the extent and impact of targeted drone strikes. Without clear rules and transparency over these strikes, the transfer and use of armed drones often contributes to the continuation and longevity of armed conflict, greater instability, human rights abuses, and civilian harm, and also challenges norms governing the rule of law. So for the last several years, in an effort to underscore and address these issues, civil society groups, legal experts, the United Nations and its subsidiary bodies, and others have called for greater international coordination on the development of international standards and norms for armed drones. So in general, those that believe that a more robust international framework is needed realize that in many ways, the unique capabilities and consequences presented by armed drones are not sufficiently covered by existing standards and regulatory regimes. And so there is a need for forward-looking international norms relating to the use of lethal force by states outside traditional war settings to avoid civilian harm and impunity. So today we're going to examine all of those issues and review various options to establish global drone standards. And I'm pleased to be joined by really stellar panelists who are experts on this topic and who have been involved in these efforts for many years. So first we have Dr. Agnès Calamar, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions. She's been serving in this role since August 2016. Dr. Calamar has a distinguished career in human rights and humanitarian work globally in civil society organizations, the United Nations, and in academia. She is also the director of Columbia University's Global Freedom of Expression, and she works as a special advisor to the president of Columbia University. And I'm very glad that she could join us today from France. Maritza Chan is the ambassador, deputy permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations, New York, just a new post as of March 2020. She served before as the permanent mission of Costa Rica to the United Nations in New York. And during her tenure, she was Costa Rica's arms trade treaty lead negotiator. She's also served at the permanent mission of Costa Rica to the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., and at the Embassy of Costa Rica to the United States in Washington, D.C. In 2018, Maritza returned to Washington as the head of the political and security section at the Embassy of Costa Rica. We are very sorry to have her leave DC after so many years here, but delighted that she has returned to New York and we can continue to work with her in her new role. So welcome, Maritza. Bill Malzahn is the Senior Policy Advisor within the Office of Conventional Arms Threat Reduction at the U.S. Department of State. He has worked on multilateral arms control, disarmament, and nonproliferation for more than 30 years, focusing on issues involving conventional weapons. He's currently the lead for the U.S. government on the 53-nation Joint Declaration on the Export and Subsequent Use of Armed or Strike-Enabled Armed UAVs that was signed in 2016. And we're very glad to have Bill here to give us an update on that process. And finally, but not least, my partner in all of these efforts, Wim Zwijnenberg, is a humanitarian project leader for the Dutch peace organization PAX. His work focuses on emerging technologies and their impact on how wars are being fought and consequences for arms proliferation. He is the author of several reports on the transfer and use of armed drones, which we generally launch at these events every year. So I'm glad we have another one to talk about today, and is also the coordinator of the European Forum on Armed Drones, which is a network of civil society organizations working to address concerns over proliferation and use of military drones. So as you can see, I have great experts with me this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are, to talk about these issues. Each of our speakers is going to provide some introductory remarks. And then, as I mentioned, we will open the floor to an open discussion. So please, again, feel free to leave any questions in the Q&A on the bottom of your screen, and I will make sure to get to those. So first, I'd like to turn things over to Agnès to speak on the role that the UN Special Rapporteur has played in guiding the global discussion on the impact and risks associated with lethal drone use, and her latest report and its recommendation for a transparent multilateral process to develop international drone standards. Good morning, Agnès, and thank you for joining us. You have to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to all for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be joining you. As you pointed out in the introduction, as a special rapporteur on extrajudicial execution, I issued a report on drone proliferation and the implication for right to life issue in June of this year, largely triggered by the drone strike against the Iranian General Soleimani in January. For the purpose of this presentation, I would like to highlight three main concerns that I have with the current situation as far as the drones are concerned. And I have to say that I am making these assessments on the back of almost 10 years of reports by special rapporteur on the issue of drone strike and drone targeted killings. So the first main concern that has already been highlighted is with the unbounded and uncontrolled proliferation of drone. In the report, I refer to a second drone age in which a vast number of state and non-state actors are deploying ever more advanced drone technologies. It seems to me, based on the research conducted, that many states are eager to join the so-called drone power club. As of 2020, 102 countries had an active military drone inventory. 40 were using or at least procuring armed drones. And a vast number of non-state actors have also procured and used armed drones to fairly strong effect. You have already mentioned the multiplication of drone war and proxy drone wars as well, meaning that various powers are fighting each other through others and through drones. Those developments have inevitably affected the lives of civilians, and in my view, there are far more casualties that can be attributed to drone strike than are acknowledged or reported. And the lack of good methodology for assessing the impact of drone strikes is a major issue, particularly for my mandate. It is estimated, for instance, that in Syria, the Pentagon's estimate for the killings of civilians differ by a factor of 20 to 50 from independent assessors. So there is a real issue of independent, thorough, objective assessment of the impact of a drone strike. Of course, killings are not the only implication of drone strike. People who live under the constant watch of drones speak of a daily terror, speak of the psychological impact of that persistent watch and the persistent noise and the fear, the constant anticipation of a drone attack. So that's a first bunch of major concerns, and we can go back to them. The second, and you've also hinted to them as well, is that there is no effective oversight mechanisms, both domestically and internationally. So domestically, in my view, oversight is of very poor quality. Drones tend to fall between the cracks, neither a military weapon nor a policing one. They are an intelligence tool, or initially was treated as an intelligence tool rather than a military tool, and therefore did not receive the same kind of oversight than a military weapon. A few countries have specifically identified the use of drones for parliamentary oversight, and in general, a country's lethal use of drone is not subject to prior approval by Parliament, even though under the so-called first strike theory, their use could trigger an international armed conflict. So there is a major contradiction here. Thus far, courts, which should provide some form of oversight, have refused to do so, arguing that such matters are political or relate to international relations between states and are therefore non-justiciable. This blanket denial of justiciability over the extraterritorial use of force or indeed surveillance, in my view, cannot be reconciled with recognized principles domestically or internationally, cannot be reconciled with treaty obligations, and are likely to violate the right to life and to remedies. There have been a few notable exceptions, and maybe we can return to that. There is a watershed ruling of Rhine-Westphalia Higher Administrative Court on the legal responsibilities of Germany at the host of the United States drone operations, but it is unclear as today. The implications of this ruling remain unclear. So domestically, very few oversight mechanisms. Have already highlighted the absence of methodology over a thorough assessment of the implications and consequence of a drone strike. And you've already hinted to the main problem of transparency. So here we have a bunch of very crucial limitations, I will say, to the rule of law that any drone programs around the world are triggering everywhere, I will say, with a little bit of degrees, but these are across the road problem. And these are compounded by the absence of an international regulatory system. So in August, the Trump administration has announced that it was withdrawing from the Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR, and in part the withdrawal was triggered by the fact that they wanted or needed to reinterpret the MTCR in order to ensure that some of their most well-sold drones could escape from the MTCR regulation. It is also, and I think it's fair to say, that the MTCR is becoming outdated in any case to deal with the proliferation of weapons and in particular of drones. But the American withdrawal from the MTCR is further weakening the only real mechanism, as limited as it may have been, to control some aspect of drone proliferation. While we all agree that this was not and is not an appropriate mechanism, this withdrawal by the US certainly did not help the overall situation, and will do very little to address drones proliferation and their impact on population, and in fact is likely to exacerbate the problem. So in my report, I note that, and a number of other issues, but I will stop now just to highlight a few recommendations. Clearly, we need a drone technology control regime. We need that at a time where the world is entering very wholeheartedly an arms race, triggered by the restructuring of the international political system. So we are at a difficult moment to negotiate any kind of arms treaty, or even if it's not a treaty, something amounting or closer to that. Still, my view is that if we wait for the best conditions possible for the adoption of a treaty, we probably will never do it. So we, as an international community, and at least those states that are concerned with the proliferation of drones and what they mean for international law and the international rules of the international system, those states should really move forward and initiate a process where we unpack what a drone technology control regime should look like. Ideally, we would like to do that through a UN multilateral process. As it may be quite unlikely, I think it is very important to call on some of the states that are concerned, such as Costa Rica, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and others, to initiate that process by relying on a multi-stakeholder approach, academic expert, military expert, and so on, who together can draw out what a regime should and could look like, in order that we control the free-for-all that is currently emerging in the second drone age. And what this control regime will look like, I will not get into the details, but at the minimum, we need to have stricter control on the transfer of military and dual-use drone technology. We need to have criteria to prevent so-called irresponsible transfers. There needs to be clear adherence to civilian protection, clear adherence to human rights and humanitarian laws for the continuing of sale of armed drone and indeed training. So all together, I think state can, or some states with civil society and expert, I think there is a fairly important number of people and institutions that are committed to do something. We need to initiate the process, and if it may not come to a closure very quickly, at least it will set some rules on the international agenda. And that's one big objective for the moment, given the international context. We absolutely need to disrupt the modus operandi around the sale, the distribution, the lack of control on drones. We've got to disrupt that, if only by pushing and putting standards on the international agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And yes, I think certainly if you haven't had a chance to look at the report that you were just referring to, I would strongly encourage people to do so, because I think it really lays out many of the issues you mentioned in your presentation and highlights a potential way forward. It's a very good transition also to our next speaker, Bill Malzahn, because I think Bill is going to talk about such a potential process, and it was mentioned in his intro, this US-led process for establishing international drones in standards, and hopefully can offer some insights on where that's at and what it may look like. For those who are not familiar with that process, this is an initiative from 2016 that recognized the risks associated with the potential misuse of lethal drones and tried to sort of put down a marker that more would be needed, more international standards would be needed to address proliferation and misuse. So Bill, let me turn it over to you for your remarks. Thank you. Remind you to, yes, there.
Hi, thank you, Rachel, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I thought I would start by briefly reviewing the different multilateral instruments or venues that currently address the issue of armed unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs, because there are actually some existing ones. As to whether they're adequate or not, that's a different issue, but there are some that are out there. So I just wanted to briefly run through those for a minute. The first one is the UN Register of Conventional Arms. Armed UAVs were added to the UN Register in 2016. And the UN Register requires participating member states to report annually on their imports and exports of covered weapons, and this information is made publicly available. So this is a transparency mechanism that relates to international transfers of armed UAVs. The second forum is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or CCW. The CCW has been discussing issues related to the use of armed UAVs for a number of years, and it's been happening under the general rubric of lethal autonomous weapon systems or laws, but it has not yet moved beyond discussion. So it's, and the CCW is a forum that tries to balance military interests with humanitarian concerns. So in many ways, it seems like an ideal place to discuss some of the issues that Agnes mentioned in her presentation. Then the next one is the Arms Trade Treaty. The Arms Trade Treaty provides international standards for the responsible international trade in conventional arms, and that includes armed unmanned aerial vehicles. Then there are two export control regimes that address the issue of UAVs. The first is the Wassenaar Arrangement. The Wassenaar Arrangement is a multilateral export control regime which was established to contribute to regional and international security and stability by promoting transparency and greater responsibility in transfers of conventional arms and dual-use goods and technologies. And the Wassenaar regime also includes unmanned aerial vehicles, both armed and unarmed, as one of the items that its members report on and have controls on. And members report annually or report semi-annually on their exports to non-Wassenaar states, but this reporting is not made publicly available. So this is private reporting. So it's not as it doesn't reach as large an audience as the UN Register does. Then there's the Missile Technology Control Regime. The 35 members of the MTCR seek to limit the proliferation of missiles and missile technology, and the MTCR includes unmanned aerial vehicles. And then finally, there is the Joint Declaration for the Export and Subsequent Use of Armed or Strike-Enabled UAVs, which Rachel mentioned in her introduction. And that's what I'm here today to talk about. I'll refer to this as the Joint Declaration, by the way. In 2016, the United States and 52 other countries issued the Joint Declaration for the Export and Subsequent Use of Armed or Strike-Enabled Unmanned Aerial Vehicles. The Joint Declaration is a political declaration containing general principles to ensure the responsible export and subsequent use of this rapidly expanding technology. The Joint Declaration establishes a broad international consensus that, as with other weapon systems, the use of these systems is subject to international law. It commits to the responsible export of these systems in line with existing relevant international norms. It acknowledges the benefits of transparency on these systems, including reporting of military exports through existing mechanisms where appropriate. It pledges continued international dialogue about the export and use of armed UAVs in light of the rapid development and proliferation of UAV technology. And it welcomes additional countries to join the Joint Declaration. So at this point in time, as I said, there are 53 countries which have signed up to this political declaration. The Joint Declaration was intended to serve as the basis for discussions on a more detailed set of international standards for the export and subsequent use of these systems. After the Joint Declaration was issued, the United States joined with a small group of other Joint Declaration countries to begin working on draft international standards for the export and subsequent use of armed UAVs. While I can't go into specifics about these standards right now, as they haven't been finalized and adopted by Joint Declaration countries, I can discuss our general approach in these discussions. We started with the Joint Declaration itself, and we sought to add substance to it so that it could be the basis for real-world action. Essentially, we wanted to operationalize the Joint Declaration to turn it into something more than just a political declaration. Building on the principles in the Joint Declaration, we have worked together to identify practical measures that would help ensure the responsible export and subsequent use of these systems, while recognizing the legitimate interest of any state to indigenously produce, export, or acquire such systems for legitimate purposes. We hope that these standards will ensure that these weapons are used consistent with international law, including the law of armed conflict and international human rights law, and with applicable international arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, and export control arrangements and regimes. They are intended to complement and reinforce existing international efforts to curb the irresponsible transfer and use of conventional arms. We expect to take the results of our work shortly to all the Joint Declaration countries for adoption. After that, we intend to reach outside the Joint Declaration and engage others in an effort to ensure that all states that use and transfer armed unmanned aerial vehicles commit to these standards. We hope that they will provide a foundation for further work as the international community continues to discuss armed unmanned aerial vehicles. Let me close by taking a few moments to talk about the relationship for the United States of the Joint Declaration, the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy, or CAT policy, the Unmanned Aerial Systems Export Policy, and the MTCR. The CAT policy provides the broad overarching policy guidance for how the US conducts conventional arms exports, all conventional arms exports. The UAS export policy is a subset of the CAT policy in providing policy guidance specific to exports of armed unmanned aerial systems. These two policies drive US efforts on exports of UAVs or UASs. Internationally, the US has been pursuing discussions on UAVs in two initiatives, one in the MTCR and the second in the Joint Declaration. In the MTCR, the US has sought to clarify how UAV exports are treated in the context of that regime. In a broader international context, the US pursued the Joint Declaration initiative in an effort to ensure that UAVs that were exported and subsequent use were done so in a responsible manner. The Joint Declaration only addresses armed UAVs, while the MTCR initiative addresses exports of both armed and unarmed UAVs. So it includes a broader spectrum of UAV systems. The two initiatives complement each other, but are not linked or directly connected. Progress on one is not linked to progress on the other, but we do hope to make progress on both. And let me close by actually just clarifying one thing. The US has not withdrawn from the MTCR. Quite the contrary, we remain committed to the MTCR. What we have done, what we announced in August 2018 was that we were going to exercise within the context of the MTCR unilateral national authority to interpret certain things. So I want to just emphasize that the US remains a committed member of the MTCR and is committed to it as an important non-proliferation tool to curb the spread of missile technologies to countries such as North Korea and Iran. The policy that was announced in August is being undertaken within and consistent with MTCR guidelines. And I'm happy to talk more about this during the question and answer session, but let me also just point out that I'm not an expert on the MTCR at all. I'm an expert on the Joint Declaration and things related to it in the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And I see we already have questions about the appropriateness of the MTCR versus the Wassenaar arrangement and some of the other instruments that you mentioned as a forum for controlling the proliferation and use of arms drones. So I'll encourage you to look at those questions so you get a sneak peek of what is to come. I want to turn now to Maritza to offer some thoughts and insights from the perspective of a state that shares an interest in developing comprehensive and meaningful standards on the proliferation and use of armed drones, but is not a major exporter or importer or user of this technology. So you have a little bit of a different perspective. And so I'm wondering if you can talk with us about the benefits of a multilateral approach compared to, say, simply an effort that is driven by the major drones exporters and importers. So thank you for joining us and welcome your thoughts.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. It is a privilege to be able to join this panel today, and I'm grateful to the Stimson Center and PAX for convening yet another timely and informative event on armed drones and efforts to multilaterally moderate and standardize their transfer and use. As we see in the headlines around the world, lethal drones continue to shape conflict and raise questions about appropriate and responsible transfer and use. These are ongoing questions, and they underscore the importance of pursuing international standards for armed drones as the world has entered what has been called the second drone age. This is not just an issue for importers and exporters and users of drones, but for all states that are concerned about the rule of law. Costa Rica is one of those states. We're seeing an increase in proliferation of and use of drones, as well as a proliferation of regulatory regimes and agreements. It is important to underscore and reinforce the point that efforts to establish new international standards on drones must support and strengthen, not undermine, existing international laws, regulatory regimes, and agreements, the regimes on related issues such as international human rights and humanitarian laws and the Amsterdam Treaty. Different standards and rules guiding drones transfers and use, that is, those enumerated in the international laws and multilateral regulations, the Global Counterterrorism Forum and the Amsterdam Treaty, and in other export control regimes, could lead to confusion for states over which rules and standards to follow or to apply. Therefore, the process to develop global drone standards should build confidence in these measures and be open and transparent. Let me say that again. The process to develop global drone standards should build confidence in these measures and be open and transparent. This means involving multiple stakeholders such as civil society, states, including those that are not considered major exporting or importing countries and industry, to ensure that the international standards being developed are understood, applicable, and relevant. Indeed, it will be important to bridge the gap between manufacturing states, importing states, states that have consented for their territory to be used to launch drones, or there have been drone operations with the quiescence of the government, and those states do not have nor seek drone technology. A multilateral process to develop drone standards should help address these gaps. Another alternative I think worth highlighting in this regard, and which is featured in the Special Rapporteur's June 2020 report on extrajudicial killings, is to convene like-minded states to develop a group of experts to establish a group of experts to develop such standards as part of a time-bound forum for states, academics, and civil society to identify and strengthen legal norms and accountability mechanisms. Such mechanism could help encourage a variety of states with interest in these issues to become more actively involved. A broader discussion on the implication of remote control warfare is highly needed. The use of armed drone strikes is considered as an easy fix for complex conflicts, yet failed to produce a sustainable solution to the conflict in the areas where these strikes took place. This debate should not only be about legal policies, but about the lives of those affected and counter the misleading paradigm of low cost and risk-free warfare, as it is merely a shift of risk to those civilians unable to defend themselves and set out new patterns of violence without providing a horizon of constructive solutions. This debate must be framed around considerations of the human impact of our drones, including humanitarian, human rights, and human security dimension, as well as moral and ethical standards. Today, we have an opportunity to get into more detail regarding the use and impact of these weapons on lives, livelihoods, and human rights. And we hope this webinar can help as a start point for this further discussion. Costa Rica stands ready to join this debate. I thank you.
Thank you, Maritza. I think your perspectives on what such a forum to discuss international drone standards looks like in terms of being comprehensive and transparent and including all stakeholders is certainly one that the questions in the chat are referring to, and what forum would be most appropriate for that. So I think we'll come back to some of the important points that you raised in our discussion, but having your perspective as a country that is very concerned about the issues of both proliferation and use is quite useful to framing this conversation as more than just looking at existing conflicts and those involved in the provision of the technology at this point. So last but not least, I want to turn to my colleague Wim to discuss for us and highlight some of the key considerations and concerns around the growing use and proliferation of lethal drones, particularly as outlined and detailed in your new report, Violent Skies, How Lethal Drone Technology is Shaping Contemporary Warfare. I think I got the title right. And how might a better understanding of the increasing access to and evolving use of drone technology inform the development of international drone standards? And while you are speaking, I'm going to put the link to your report in the chat. I've also put the Special Rapporteur's report in the chat. And so for those who haven't had a chance yet to review the report, it will be available to you. So Wim, turning it over to you.
Excellent, and thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for the introduction, and great to see so much interest in this topic. And thanks for everyone joining us all over the world. My name is Wim Zwijnenburg. I work for PAX, the Dutch peace organization, and I've been working on the issue of armed drones over the last 10 years already. And today, I'm going to talk about our new report, Violent Skies, which we launched last month. And in the report, we're trying to outline some of the issues linked with armed drone proliferation and use, and why this is a incentive for states and multilateral forum to discuss like how drone technology is reshaping warfare. And in the end of the presentation, I will come back to some suggestions on how to move this forward, as that was the promise we made for those who are interested in the subject. So let's see. Just a little bit of back history, and hopefully I can already answer some questions asked in the chat as well. We've seen the rise of drone warfare since 2000 onwards, in particular with the response to the 9/11 attacks in the US. The US was looking for ways to have access and surveillance over areas in Pakistan and Afghanistan, where drones provided a really useful tool to loiter over areas which were inaccessible to troops on the ground or difficult to access or with high risk, and they could have surveillance. And later on, they were equipped with weapons to limit the responsibility for pilot aircraft, so they could strike when they saw a target. The reason why drones were developed there is, there were no risk to their own troops, and they're fairly cheap to use. And as I mentioned, there's persistent surveillance over an area. So they also were helpful already in previous conflicts, limited use. We saw limited use, of course, in the Gulf War, where and other wars as well, where smaller drones were provided with cameras for surveillance. But they definitely took an uptick in post-2001. And in particular, the use of armed drones since 2002, when the first strike was happened in Yemen, we saw drones as the counter-terrorism tool by the CIA with their extrajudicial killing program in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, where thousands of strikes with armed drones were carried out against suspected militants, but also hundreds of civilians were killed and many more wounded in those operations, which caused the interest from many other organizations to understand these dynamics. At the same time, we also seen armed drones in normal military operations on the battlefield, where they can provide close air support and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance options, being more precise and also being able to distinguish better between civilians and combatants. So having said that, there's also definitely the understanding that there is an advantage of deploying more drones. But this in this presentation, we'll focus a bit more on how is it reshaping military tactics and strategy, because that's also helpful to understand how we see drones in the future, in the near future. So we're looking ahead like next 5 to 10 years, where we see smaller types of drones, cheaper type of drones, swarm technologies being used that could definitely reshape security dilemmas and also the issues around detection of civilians in armed conflict. So as I mentioned, some key questions we want to answer in this presentation. How do states and non-state actors deploy drones? And we will be looking at two case studies we've used for our report, which is Yemen and Eastern Ukraine. We could also easily pick Syria or Iraq or Libya or currently Nagorno-Karabakh, but that was a bit too recent to include. But it's really interesting because we also looked at two different areas, two different regions, because it also helped understanding how fast states and non-state actors can adapt to the battlefield with accessibility to technology. And where do they get their materials from, their expertise, how is it functioning, because it also guides discussions on proliferation and export controls. Next, we will also look at the tactics and strategies and how this is also influencing security perceptions from states on the ground and also non-state actors. And lastly, this is also guiding, as mentioned, the discussions on security, but also disarmament on what kind of fora are helpful to discuss this developments in technology. And we're talking now about drones, but it's easily can be used for other types of technologies that are currently in development that we'll see being weaponized or on the battlefield. So for example, laser weapons or direct energy weapons, which are also not covered under existing disarmament discussions. So going back to drones, there's so many different kind of drones. We used when I reported the NATO classification for drones because we have micro drones, which are handheld, the size of a bug or a small bird, which are used by special forces already a lot in various countries, which can be helpful to peek around the corner and check out what's happening there with a small camera. We have medium-sized drones, tactical drones that can be locally launched by troops to collect data on what's happening to get a sort of better situational awareness on the battlefield. We have loitering drones or kamikaze drones, which are basically loitering munitions. They're launched from a tube, which can be basically a flying hand grenade, but can be very precise, but it's based on drone technology. So I will include them for the discussion's sake under the drone number. And then we have larger type of drones. We can carry multiple payloads, sensor systems, missiles, bombs, and then of course the very large systems. For example, the Global Hawk we've seen, which was shut down last year, which has a very large capability of carrying all kinds of sensors, and we're probably looking at other types of drones in this category as well. So it's a quite a broad range, but we're all seeing them on the battlefield. So from commercial ones like DJI helicopters, DJI quadcopters, being modified to the larger drones we've seen are currently being used en masse by Turkey in various conflicts. So we start off with Yemen, and Yemen is a very interesting one. It's the country where the first armed drone strike took place in 2002 against a suspected Al-Qaeda militant, and where the target killings campaign really had an impact on the civilian population because of the constant presence of drones. So basically there was the US starting their drone campaign there for targeted killings, but later on other states who were involved in the conflict against Ansar Allah, or better known as the Houthis, started to deploy unarmed and armed drones as well. In particular, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have deployed Chinese versions of their Winglungs and the CH-4 drones, but very soon on, we also noticed that commercial drones popped up in this conflict, imported from various countries. We noticed that it was documented by various experts, including UN experts, that Iran played an important role in providing technology and expertise and engineering to the Houthis for deploying or building loitering munitions, which were deployed against a range of targets inside Yemen, but also against targets in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates, where they have been used to target civilian infrastructure, including oil refineries and water filtration stations, but also airports. And we've seen commercial drones being weaponized on the battlefield or being used for surveillance and surveilling troop movements, or guiding artillery, or guiding mortar, guiding strikes, etc. And in this case, in the case of Yemen, it's kind of interesting to see like where in the world this information or the technology was coming from and who was using them. And it's quite a broad selection of states that, and in particular states with the drone industry, that provided different kinds of parts and components which were used in either locally built drones or complete drone systems which were deployed. And it's also helpful to understand the dynamics in the conflict. So in particular, where the Houthis were very rapidly adapting to the situation on the ground. And it also was interesting in terms of responding to that. So the Houthis were, again, with likely support of state actors, able to target the US and the large type of drones, combat drones, such as the Reaper and the Predator, but also the Chinese drones flying over the territory and shoot them down. So this is also interesting to understand for the dynamic when it comes to drone and counter-drone technology. So these kind of large type of drones are able to have persistent surveillance and deployment if there's no threat to them. But we will likely also see more states and non-state actors seeking ways to counter this kind of drone threat. So it's also interesting to follow now what's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, where the Turkish TB Bayraktar drones operated by Azerbaijan, or are actually probably by Turkey, but in support of Azerbaijan and Israeli loitering munitions, have been really wreaking havoc among Armenian troops, but because there is little to no updated air defense systems against those kind of drones. So there probably will be lessons learned there for other areas. Moving over to Ukraine, which was also very interesting to read about and to dive into, because we also noticed in the Ukraine that, in particular in the beginning, when in 2014, when Russia-backed separatists started a war against a war of succession from Ukraine, which were. And they were very much in favor because they were backed by Russia, who had their own military drones based on Israeli types of drones and their own drone industry, which gave them an advantage on the battlefield by spotting Ukrainian troops and also volunteer brigades, which were fighting alongside with the Ukrainian army against the separatists. At the same time, the Ukrainian army, which basically had a non-existent drone capabilities, but were they're rapidly evolving by all kinds of civil engineers who started help building the drone industry, local drone industry, and we saw a lot of civilian technology there being used in shaping their drone industry. And now they have made quite some advances in developing medium kind of drones that are also capable of carrying explosive or lethal payloads. We haven't seen so much deployment yet of those kind of drones, but they certainly are taking their place, and it shows how civilian technology can play or dual use technology is an important aspect of the discussion on drone technology, because we see that this is easily being adapted by state and non-state actors to create abilities to and have drones and also payloads, carry explosive payloads over long distance on the battlefield. So again, we saw here as well in Ukraine the response to drones by counter-drone technology, by jamming systems. We saw the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who was monitoring the Minsk agreements to keep the peace and monitoring the movement of weapons that are regularly targeted with weapons, but also jamming systems from the separatists that take out they're trying to take out the OCSE drones who are monitoring the movements. And it's likely those kind of lessons learned on the electronic warfare against drones are shaping tactics. And we also see how drones themselves are being used, smaller drones and larger drones. I'll give you one example, which I find very interesting, where one drone, a smaller drone, was used as a sort of bait. As a commercial drone was flying around over an area where Ukrainian troops were based. So they start firing at the smaller drone. Above that smaller drone, there was a larger drone flying with cameras, which then helped targeting the artillery from the separatists to strike the Ukrainian army. So those kind of tactics are easily deployed on the battlefield. So that's also where the states and non-state actors see the advantages of having drones in spotting and tracing and tracking enemy troops. And so it's using a small commercial drone as sacrifice for a military advantage. So those are the kinds of developments which drones are making capable. So what are sort of, and if you want to read the full report, it will be in the chat. What kind of lessons have we learned from here, from how drones are reshaping warfare? So initially, we see drones are improving situational awareness and targeting support on the battlefield. So that's already going on since the early 80s, where when drones were developed, and they've become key in any military all over the world. We have now over 100 militaries using drones in their operations, and they've been sort of become an asset to any operations on the ground. The next step, I think that's sort of the taken here. The next step is the payload and precision. So drones are able to carry a lethal payload and very precisely hit a target over a long distance. Now, this is a clear advantage for states and non-state actors, where drones are reshaping security dilemmas, because where before you can easily install, defend yourself and set up a security perimeter against any troops moving or other vehicles on the ground, but with drones coming in from the sky, which are small and with lethal payloads, both in conflicts, but also in domestic policing situations or counterterrorism operations, or prevention against terrorist attacks in a national context. That availability and access to this technology is reshaping security questions as well. So that's a new element that drones are bringing now to warfare. And with the increase of access to payloads and the platforms themselves becoming cheaper, the ability to create swarms of drones flying hundreds, maybe thousands drones at the same time with a small payload makes it very difficult to defend yourself against. And the last element is the force projection, which we've seen also with the Houthis, for example, in Yemen, where their ability to demonstrate they could hit their targets helped their negotiation position with the Saudis. And I think that's also happening. We see the same thing happening in Libya, and we see the same thing happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, where cheap disposable drones can be used in military operations and change the role on the battlefield. And clearly, Nagorno-Karabakh is a good case of that. So we've mentioned now, okay, what's next? And thanks, Bill, for laying out the land a little bit already, or quite a lot on export control and on norms. So on the left side, you see what are the norms, what are the fora where we can discuss the use of norms. And it's kind of a complex picture here when it comes to both export and norms. When it comes to international legal frameworks, we've been very clear already for the last 10 years. Like, what we need is states defining national positions on the use of drones, on the use of lethal force in and outside battlefields. So the international humanitarian law is quite clear what you can, what you can't do. But international human rights law is also quite clear, but there are states who risk undermining that by creating their own interpretation. I think that's where other states should step up and clarify how they view their interpretation of the use of lethal force outside armed conflicts. And that helps start strengthening the norm. Where can we do that? Well, for example, the work by Dr. Kalamar is very helpful in the Human Rights Council. So potentially that's a good area to explore a bit further, where states can clarify their positions and engage on that. We've seen the discussion being raised in General Assembly, like we're doing right now, through either the forums, discussions, or side events. It has been raised in the Security Council in some last year, and UN special or group of experts have published reports on the proliferation of technology and use, which are helpful in shaping a discussion. And there is potential, for example, other UN bodies where we are in need of a multilateral dialogue on, okay, how are these technologies, and it's not exclusively drones, but like I mentioned earlier, can be other technologies as well. How is that reshaping our thinking about the use of lethal force in and outside armed conflicts? And that helps creating a dialogue with states, like what kind of changes do we see and how can we move forward on that? Which brings me to the next page, the the export control mechanisms. They have been raised by Bill again. But perhaps there can also be progress made on, can we improve risk assessments of export of drone technology or related technology. Again, what we saw also, like the dual use dilemma. We've spoken to various government officials about this from various states, and this will be a challenge for the coming decade, because there are many legal or like normal uses of UAVs in for commercial purposes, which are very legit and can be very helpful. But it's also easy to see how that can be misused. So how do we find a balance in that to prevent those kind of technologies ending up in the wrong hands? And lastly, like, so I've already outlined some of these avenues for moving forward. So can we do an evaluation of existing export control regimes vis-a-vis drone technology? It's now sort of patchwork where we all see different elements coming back in different frameworks, but some of the control agreements are limited because of their participation, like the Wassenaar Arrangement and the MTCR, while there are other states who are not part of that, but are also developing drones and keen to export them. Can we update relevant risk assessments, for example, under the ATT? Clearly, there should be a role for the defense and civilian industry on drone technology, as I just mentioned on the dual use dilemma. What kind of developments are being made, and how can we prevent this as being misused? Can we consider potentially a group of experts that informs these relevant multilateral forums on technology? So how can we understand what's happening on the battlefields, and can we easily engage with states? Okay, how can we? I think it will be a constant process of fine tuning and here and there on and pushing different buttons, because the technology is progressing very rapidly and always policy is outdated. But we can do by having access to the right information and analysis, we can easily faster inform debate in those kind of forums. And then, yeah, also laid out, like, we need to have a platform for dialogue on the use of drones, because it's definitely, there's no home for the drone where we can discuss this. And the last point is, like, yeah, outlining clear legal positions, which is definitely needed to prevent the further misuse of drone technology. I'm probably going way over time, but apologies for that. But I think this is a really great opportunity to further that discussion with states and seek opportunities to prevent misuse and eventually protect civilians and protect peace. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Wim. There have been a lot of comments about your PowerPoint, so I hope we can make that available on the Stimson website so people can not only review the video, but look at your beautiful PowerPoint as well. So for those who posted that in the chat or sent me private messages, please know we're on that and we'll get those to you. Thanks to all of you for your really insightful comments, and what's the chat has been, and the Q&A has been really blowing up in terms of numerous questions that I fear I'm not going to get to all of. So I'm going to try and put some of those together in sort of common themes in order to address as many of them as possible. And one that has come up particularly for Bill and Agnes is this notion of what forum is appropriate to develop international drone standards. There was a lot of questions in the chat about the notion, and Wim sort of had this on his penultimate slide, about there are numerous mechanisms and arrangements and agreements to address proliferation issues. We can argue about which is the most appropriate. Is the MTCR, which is focused on delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction, is that where we should have those regulatory controls? Is it better suited in the Wassenaar Arrangement, but that only suits, 40 some countries? So the question is, what forum, and is this the challenge, I think, that has plagued all of us working on this issue for so many years is this connection between proliferation and use. So how do we find, or what is the appropriate forum that brings issues of proliferation and brings issues of use together? So it's not just the IHL and human rights concerns, it's not just the proliferation and export control concerns, but where is appropriate to discuss those issues in their entirety in a comprehensive manner, and just using Maritza's point, in a inclusive manner that includes industry and civil society and other key stakeholders as well as states. So I'll open it up to Agnes and Bill, but certainly Wim and Maritza should feel free to comment on that as well.
Well, I guess I'll take a first stab at answering part of that. So it seems that the starting point for any effort to talk about proliferation and stuff is you have to know where they're proliferating to. You have to know about the international transfers and the like. So that's where something like the UN Register can be useful for some of the UAVs that are proliferating or something else. But in order to talk about proliferation, again, you have to know where they're going to. That's the starting point as far as the proliferation angle goes. But as I briefly mentioned in my opening comments, in terms of a broader discussion on this, the place that seems most appropriate to me is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, because that's a forum that's set up by design to balance humanitarian concerns and interests with military concerns and interests. And it brings stakeholders from both camps together to talk about trying to find a balance and a way forward. And the CCW, it's structured to deal with weapons that are deemed inhumane, and it talks about issues related to international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law. It seems that that's an appropriate forum to talk about it. Now, and obviously there are, in the CCW, there are 5 existing protocols that deal with other weapons, and there's no reason one couldn't do something on unmanned aerial systems or something in there. But one of the problems you have with UAVs in general is, how do I put this? Well, let me back up. So one of the principles in the joint declaration is the idea that UAVs are weapons whose use is subject to international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. So they apply to it. They're not an exceptional category outside of that. So the standards that you use for using any weapon apply to using UAVs, because in one sense, in a very broad sense, UAVs are just like other weapon systems out there. They might bring together characteristics from a number of different kinds of weapons, but they're not something that's completely outside the norm and esoteric. I mean, essentially they started off first as being based on the idea of aircraft, where you took the pilot out of the cockpit and you then you were able to miniaturize these in some cases or whatever. But they started off working, being developed from the point of view of aircraft. But now they have obviously evolved, the capabilities have evolved a great deal, and there's a great deal of interest in talking about the issues related to them. But I think that the issues surrounding the use of armed UAVs, many of those are the same issues that you talk about the use of force in different contexts, whether it's, as Agnes focuses on extrajudicial killings or something, whether that's how you feel about that in terms of its relation to international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law. It's the same general kinds of issues. So I'm not sure that there's actually one forum that either exists or that you could create which would be able to adequately deal with all the different aspects of UAV systems any more than there's one forum that can deal with all the aspects related to the use of explosives or the use of other weapons. I think that different fora have a different role to play depending on what the focus of that forum is. But that's not to say that it's ineffectual not to have it, the discussion centered on one specific forum.
Great, thanks. And yes, I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on this topic as well. There are positives and negatives to using existing forums to have these conversations, whether they are historical and bureaucratic challenges, or perhaps you don't have, always the right experts in the room that can talk across these issues. But I'm wondering, given the recommendations you outlined in your initial presentation, if you have thoughts on an appropriate forum.
Sorry. No, I don't. I mean, I think my report makes it clear. I don't believe that there is an appropriate forum at the moment. There needs to be a multiplication of forum, possibly because of the nature of that particular weapon. I'm not sure we need to focus on the forum, to be honest. I think we first need to agree what should a control regime entail, and then we can maybe determine where it will best fit. And at the moment, we don't really have in the basis for an agreement around what the development of the technology, how it should be regulated, and we lead there into autonomous weapon. We don't have an agreement internationally bound around the export or transfer of the technology, even though other standards could be applied to it. It's not the case. We don't have an agreement around the use of the technology. So, I'll say let's, we need to, in my report, I recommended that a parallel process where we determine what should be the standard for each one of those issues. And then you could, move that discussion into an existing form. We are moving into a very different world as far as the arms race. And I'm not saying that those treaties are obsolete at all. I'm just not convinced that you can extend them to ensure that they are relevant to the new, the weapons in how they work and their impact, and to the restructuring of the international multilateral system. So it's a good question. I don't have an answer. And, at the moment, as you have seen in my report, I focused much more on determining what the content of these regulations should entail.
Thanks, Agnes. I think that's an important point, because there is not agreement yet on what such a regime could and should entail. And if you, in the questions that we've received, there is a lot of discussion about the technology, the drone technology itself, the system, the platform. The genie is out of the bottle. There is proliferation that is quite widespread from a variety of sources. And so is the focus on the platform itself where discussion should be concerned? Or is it the particular capabilities, those unique capabilities that are provided? So you mentioned autonomous several times in the chat. There were questions about, shouldn't we be worried about the autonomization of these systems, their ability to employ artificial intelligence, their ability to deploy bio agents, not just missiles themselves, right? Is it the capabilities, or is it the systems that are provided? Are we looking at, is the day, as Wim talked about in his report, is the day of the large platform, is that obsolete? And now we should be more concerned about smaller drones with swarming technology or anti-aircraft measures, or what are the things that we really should be concerned about? I guess I'll pose that to all of you, because it's sort of an amalgamation of about 10 questions in the chat. But what is it that we really are interested in controlling here and having a regime, wherever that is, entail? Wim, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. I think those are very valid questions. So often we get the question, what makes a drone different from a piloted aircraft? And it's nothing new. I think what I mentioned and underscored in the beginning, they provide like unique capabilities that other types of weapons or platforms don't have, and that's why they're being used more often, either on the battlefield or outside the battlefield in operations where states would otherwise not use lethal force or would be very restrictive in their use of lethal force. And that's why I think this makes drones unique, be it for target killings or smaller types of use. I think the current case with Nagorno-Karabakh is very clear, and same as we've seen in with Turkey using drones in Idlib in Syria, or with Turkey and the UAE using drones in Libya in support of different militias, which we probably wouldn't have used with military, with piloted aircraft or with boots on the ground. So I think that's the uniqueness about drones, and that's why we are concerned, both because they can be lower the threshold to the use of force, which could either lead to escalation, or some people actually argue de-escalation because nobody would respond to shooting down a drone. But like that all depends on like who is in charge, I guess, and how much that person or that regime is able to withhold their response if drones being shot down. But I mean, that's, I think, and then that's the concern about, okay, we have this platform or multiple platforms and shapes and sizes that is able to destroy things, which could shift the balance of power in regions or between countries or in contested areas, as we see at the moment, where other types of weapons wouldn't be used, and they're really giving capabilities to states and non-state actors to use that. So I think that's why, and so there's a different types of use which we need to talk about. So the target killings part, the target killings discussion is going on for a long time now. I think that's where, and also want to make the argument, just because they have been used already and it's the genie is out of the bottle, that shouldn't, I'm not that fatalistic that it can be stopped. I mean, the same we saw with cluster munitions as well. I mean, there have been widespread use of cluster munitions, but like, we got a treaty that bans them. I'm not, that's, so there's always a possibility to constrain, but that's also the norm. So we need to build on what is acceptable use of force, where should, there's always a gray area, and it's not a black and white discussion we're having at the moment on drones are bad or drones are good, but like, how do we fine tune, how we keep fine tuning that in that, and that's why we need states to speak out, to clarify that, to underscore the security risks posed by drones in the wrong hands, and to also engage states who misuse them as well, and that's helps strengthening that norm. So I think both in their use as well as in their proliferation, to seek where we can improve or fine-tune those controls to prevent ending up in the wrong hands. But that's definitely not like, just because it's there doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it. I mean, there's still the possibility, but that's up to states to lead us forward, and yeah, and that's where we're hoping to see progress in the next couple of years, where states take this serious, because it's now a faraway show, but when it gets closer to home, I think perhaps that makes it more urgent for states to address acknowledge the risk posed by drones.
Thanks, Wim. Anyone else want to address that question? If not, I'll go to the next set of questions, which is really, we've been talking very much about use and export and import by states, and forum, which traditionally involves states and national governments. And so there were questions about both the involvement and engagement of non-state actors and their role in both proliferation and use that is not always in accordance with international legal constructs, as well as the involvement of states that have demonstrated an unwillingness to either be part of or participate in existing regimes and act in accordance with international law. So how do you get and engage both non-state actors in these conversations and minimize the potential risk and harm done by those actors, as well as, we can call them irresponsible states or states outside of the existing legal regimes? That those are two groups that in the discussion that we've had so far are seemingly left out. So how would we engage them? Who wants to take that one? Bill, is that your willingness to jump in?
Well, I'm happy to jump in because I have opinions on everything. They may not be authoritative, but I have opinions on everything for those who know me. As a starting point, I mean, this is a problem that has basically plagued multilateral negotiation, the multilateral arms control for many years. I mean, going back at least until the 1970s, and really the, or even earlier, really the emergence of non-state actors as being a significant source of whether you want to view them as being terrorists or whether you want to view them as being guerrillas or instability or something. And the international system is still trying to figure out essentially how to deal with them, because the question very rightly asks, how do you get people who are not states, who are acting outside a system that is basically based on state involvement and state responsibility? How do you bind them? And how do you compel good behavior on their part? The state dimension is a little bit easier because the system, the multilateral system, is set up to basically deal with states and deal with nation states. And you can do things like you can get the responsible states can get together and decide on general principles for how you might use something responsibly. Doesn't matter what the weapon system is, those kind of things. And they then can agree to abide by them. And as far as the irresponsible state actors outside the system, yeah, how do you force them to agree to something that restricts their ability to do, frankly, whatever the hell they want to, that benefits them? And that's, continues to be a problem. I don't have any good answers for it. And the international system hasn't come up with those answers, but it is a real problem. And all I can say as somebody who, works for a state is what we can do is we can try and make sure that when we transfer military systems or capabilities to recipients, that we know who we're transferring them to, that the recipients essentially agree to use them, somehow in a way that it is deemed responsible, and impose controls like that. But we can try and make sure that when, whatever it is, whether it's you're talking about explosives, whether you're talking about tanks, or whether you're talking about helicopters or something, that they're transferred to people that we actually intend them to be transferred to. And part of it is making sure that you shine the light of day on these transfers, and you are open and transparent about who you're transferring them to by reporting them to appropriate international instruments. Again, this doesn't solve the problem, but this helps shed some light on it.
Bill, I hate to put you on the spot, but there are quite a few questions sort of about the United States in the chat. And given we're running short on time, I just want to follow up with you, because you just talked about transparency and accountability, and there are several questions about the hypocrisy of the US for pushing sort of international standards that talk about promotion of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, at the same time where it's been less than transparent and accountable for its use of drones in areas outside of armed conflict. And I wonder if you can reconcile for us sort of the US effort to develop international standards and the US's domestic actions, as well as there's also questions about sort of the effort to control proliferation. At the same time, the US seems to be loosening its standards. And I apologize to everyone who I sort of pushed all of those questions together, but really about sort of on the one hand, the US is doing this and promoting this internationally, and on the other hand, the US is doing this domestically. Oh, you're still muted, Bill.
All right, so talking specifically about armed UAVs rather than UAVs in general, because I think that's really what the question is really trying to get at here. The U.S., as the U.S. developed armed UAVs, we grappled with the issue of how to use them in what we judged as a responsible manner. And that's something that started when we first developed them at the very beginning, back in the George W. Bush administration and in the Obama administration, when they became when they played a more important role in U.S. Counterterrorism policy. But we were grappling with the internal rules and restrictions for how we actually use them, and we have come up internally with a series of internal practices which we think actually we believe that those are consistent with international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Now, those relate to how the US use these systems. In terms of transferring these systems then to other people, other recipients, as I said, we think that you should be open and transparent about it. That's why in the UN Register context, we were the first country to raise in the UN Register, adding in either as a separate category or subcategory reporting on transfers of armed UAVs. So the international community would have a clear idea of who they're being transferred to. Because as I said earlier, the starting point for any effort to deal with proliferation or irresponsible use is to know who they're going to. So we started in the UN Register context back in 2006. We proposed adding armed UAVs into the register. And thankfully, after 10 years of discussion in 2016, they added it as a subcategory in the combat aircraft. So now they are included in the register. In 2019, a group of governmental experts clarified that. We have supported internally inside the MTCR, which I realize is not something that is visible to the outside world, but inside the MTCR, we've also talked about transparency, and there is reporting on transfers within the MTCR, between MTCR members on transfers to non-MTCR parties. In the Wassenaar arrangement, they're included in Wassenaar, again, as a subcategory of combat aircraft. And this actually is not just armed, it's also unarmed UAVs. And you're supposed to report on the transfers of UAVs which meet the general requirements of the Wassenaar arrangement. And part of the Wassenaar arrangement is that you have to have national controls. You have to include UAVs in your national control system. In the Arms Trade Treaty, which talks about all conventional weapons, they're included as part of the Arms Trade Treaty. And all state parties are required to include controls on the transfer of these systems so that it's consistent with international law and international humanitarian law and international human rights law. I mean, so if you're a state party, you are bound by the treaty to do that. So they are in there. And how do you stop people from violating the international instruments they sign up to? That's a good question. That is one that is not answerable. I mean, we've been grappling with that issue since you started having these agreements, and that's something that we're still trying to deal with. But again, for the United States, we believe that that our use of UAVs is consistent with our international commitments and obligations.
Can I intervene there, Rachel?
Yes.
I think I would like to say two things. The first is that a focus on what the US does wrongly is important, but is really not going to get us very far. Simply because in the current international system, we cannot overlook what other actors are doing. And I will first mention China, which has been developing its armed drone program extremely well and extremely fast, and is one of the main supplier of military drones around the world, and it is a supplier that is absolutely unbounded either by domestic systems and as incomplete and unsatisfactory the US one is, at least we can talk about it. Now, it's not the case in China. So it's not unbounded by the domestic oversight, and it is not unbounded by its international commitment, because it has not been, it was at least not part of the It was not party to the MTCR as far as I recall. So we absolutely, and I'm not saying that we should not focus on the US, but when it comes to drones proliferation, when it comes to drone to control over the use, the proliferation, and the transfer of drones, to focus on the US is not going to get us. Is not going to allow us to address many of the implications for international peace and security, and ultimately for citizens. So we must be prepared to challenge others, beginning by China, which is a difficult one to challenge, but that must be taken into account. Now, when it comes to the US, I just want to respond very quickly to Mr. Malzahn speaker by suggesting that the American understanding of their compliance with international law is not does not match the international law understanding of their commitment. Under international law, the US has an extraterritorial obligation to protect and respect the right to life. And that is disputed by the US, but on that the US is one of the very few bunch of actors. In a similar fashion, the American interpretation of the UN Charter regarding the use of force extraterritorially, as influential as it may be, remains nevertheless a very isolated position if you take into account the full amount of member states. So, that's I think it's important to understand that when it comes to international law, the US understanding of its international obligations are actually not in keeping with what international bodies have stated are those obligations, and we need to keep hammering that message, and we need to keep putting the scrutiny of the use of force extraterritorially, whether it's the US or not, because it is very likely to violate international law. And I should add that what happened in January is an enormous red flag. And I do hope that neither the US nor the rest of the world will continue in that direction, to use drones to murder the official of another state, as awful that official may have been, is absolutely not the way to go for international peace and security.
Thanks. And yes, it pains me to say that we are out of time, because this discussion, I think, A, is fascinating, B, could continue for a very long time, and I think C, just starts to touch the tip of the iceberg, really, of all of these complex issues that we are facing. But I promised those who were attending the first committee sessions today that they would make it in time. So as much as I hate to end this conversation, I'm sort of forced to, and I recognize we've gotten, just in the last few minutes, even more questions about this subject. And so I will strongly encourage all of you to reach out to our panelists. We're all very approachable people, to discuss these issues further. I hope, again, this is, as we say every year, this is really not the end of our conversation, but really the next chapter in our conversation. And I think, as hard as it is to try and sum up everything that was stated over the last hour and a half, I think there is an interest and a commitment to adopting some kind of international standards, and we'll need to look at several factors across whatever forum or forums that this takes place in. That, what is it that we are trying to regulate? What is it that we are trying to control, and the specifics of that who would be responsible for that implementation, that enforcement, that accountability? What types of technology are we really interested in? The platforms, the capabilities that it provides, particularly given such rapid technological developments. Agnes just mentioned the interpretation of legal frameworks around not only IHL and IHRL, but the use of lethal force and where and how states interpret that. What kind of, Bill talked about reporting and consultation mechanisms and ensuring that we are transparent in actions and in transfers. And then looking at how we include non-signatories or non-states parties or uncompliant states in these regimes and in these standards, I think will be incredibly important. So I think that was the best I could do in terms of summing up a very stimulating and exciting conversation that I hope will continue in other forums and venues. And certainly I can speak for Wim, I think, when I say that PAX and Stimson will continue to work together to further these conversations. Thank you to our really interesting and exciting panelists for today's event. Thank you to all of you. We had incredible participation that held at a very high level throughout this event, which demonstrates to me there is interest in having these discussions, even this for us, even this early in the morning. And thank you really to those of you who remain committed to the development of international standards and protecting civilians around the world. Please keep your safety, your health, your resiliency in these difficult times. And we look forward to seeing you and speaking with you on these issues again. Thank you.